Okay, so here we're going to talk a little bit about nasalence, nasal airflow, and how you can actually measure that. And so our intraoral air pressure is the pressure level in our oral cavity. And so when constriction builds up and occurs in that oral cavity, that intraoral air pressure measures the pressure that builds up behind that constriction. So the greater or more complete that constriction, the greater the intraoral pressure. High pressure consonants are those that are formed by relatively high levels of intraoral pressure due to that complete or very narrow constriction. So those are our plosives, our oral stops for sure, as well as arguably some of our fricatives. That intraoral pressure also varies as a function of intensity and phoneme position. So intensity is approximately proportional to 1.3 the power of the intraoral pressure. So phonemes, so so the more intense that phoneme production is, the more intraoral pressure is also occurring. In addition, our phonemes in utterance final position tend to be produced with less intraoral pressure than the same phonemes produced in initial position. And this is particularly true for our voiced sounds. So the voice cognates, comparing a final K to a final G, we're going to lose a lot more pressure with that voice consonant than the voiceless. And again, this is likely due to the tendency for most speech-related variables, including fundamental frequency as well as intensity, to fall off at the end of an utterance. And this is also why we're often seeing unreleased stops, for example, at the ends of utterances. We've just sort of lost all gumption for releasing that sound, so we're gonna close off the airflow, but just leave it at that, and we're not going to release that and get rid of what little airflow there is. Okay. Appropriate closure of our velopharyngeal port is essential for normal voice and speech production. So insufficient contact, such that there's a gap existing in that velopharyngeal port, or insufficient duration of that closure, such as whether that velopharyngeal port is prematurely opening or closing, will result in excessive nasal airflow. And excessive nasal airflow results in too much nasal resonance in the acoustic signal. And this is perceived as hypernasalization or hypernasality, however you want to refer to it. So hypernasality can decrease somebody's overall speech intelligibility in 3 ways. So first, that radiated acoustic signal has less energy. We've talked about how it's absorbed by all the nasal cavity, the sinuses, and so forth. Those nasal antiformants are dampening the acoustic radiated energy. So hypernasal speech has less intensity and may be harder for a listener to hear. In addition, the emission of excessive airflow through the nose results in additional turbulence. And this can be heard as essentially excessive noise, also referred to as nasal emission, almost like a snort. In severe cases, it really is sort of a snort. And this nasally turbulent noise interferes with the acoustic information necessary for speech comprehension. So if somebody has all this, it's going to be harder for you to understand what they're saying, and also you might just be really distracted by it. And then finally, the escape of air through that open velopharyngeal port into our nasal cavity results in decreased intraoral pressure. And so this means that a lesser volume of air is honestly available to flow through the oral cavity, which is going to decrease intelligibility of all of our oral consonants as well. Okay, so in general, nasal resonance can be perceived accurately just by listening to it. We can hear it, but no one single acoustic feature exists to guarantee the overall perception of nasality. If we want to truly characterize how much air is being emitted from the nares, we can use a mask that only covers the nose. So we can put something on their nose, and the airflow, is measured through a pneumata. Can I say that? Through a pneumatotacotograph. We're going to go with that. Pneumatotacotograph. Essentially, that's a transducer that measures airflow. So in general, our nasal airflow should be minimal to 0 for any utterance that does not contain nasal consonants. So like the dog jumped the fence, oh, there is a nasal. The dog, there's the dog sat here. The dog sat here. There's no nasals in that. There should be very little nasal airflow emitted for that production. Versus my mommy makes much money, there's a lot of nasal sounds in that. So there should be a lot of nasal airflow. That would be measured there. So nasalance is the ratio of the nasal energy as measured from the acoustic pressure waveform. So nasalance scores will be dependent upon the number of nasal phonemes within a tested utterance. So again, there should be very little, it should be a very low number for any sentence that has no nasals, and it should be very high for a sentence that has a lot, and we can compare the difference between the two. If there's no difference between the nasal and non-nasal productions, then we really have a problem in terms of much too much nasal resonance, much too much nasal airflow.